Bill McKibben, are you here? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. It is a great privilege to testify today. It's always a thrill for any Vermonter to be in this home of our citizen legislature and to be able to say thanks to all of you for your service. You've asked us not to talk about climate change itself today on the theory that everyone believes in it, and I'm more than happy to oblige, given that I wrote the first book for a general audience on the subject way back in 1989. I've spent too much of my life talking about climate change. But permit me to say one thing. The pertinent question is not whether one believes in climate change, but whether one understands the astonishing speed with which it is remaking the world. The pace and scale of the change dictate the pace and scale of our necessary response. So I think it's at least germane to note that yesterday, NASA published the list of the hottest months dating back to 1880. Of the 1,620 months on that list, January 2016 was the world record holder, followed by December, October, and November of 2015. As the New York Times noted yesterday in an extensive article, the planet's record warmth is now helping spur a wave of diseases around the planet, of which the Zika virus is only the latest. As of today, the National Snow and Ice Data Center reports that Arctic sea ice is at its lowest extent for this date ever measured. As the well-known Earth scientist Rafe Pomerantz of the National Academy of Sciences Arctic Research Panel put it, again yesterday, quote, "It's unraveling. Every piece of it is unraveling. They're all in lockstep." In January, much of the Arctic averaged 23 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. So you will excuse me, perhaps, if I speak with what may seem to some of you undue urgency. The fossil fuel divestment campaign, which people are asking that Vermont join with the same commitment that state leaders like then Treasurer Jim Douglas and then Governor Madeline Kunin brought to the fights over tobacco in South Africa, this campaign began several years ago. It started with the publication of an obscure report by a group of UK-based financial analysts called the Carbon Tracker Initiative, or CTI. What CTI did was something others of us should have done long ago. They counted. That is, they looked at all the reserves of coal and oil and gas held by the 200 biggest fossil fuel companies and the countries that act essentially as fossil fuel companies, think Venezuela. It turns out that if you add up all the reserves of these companies, the stuff that they've told regulators and banks and investors that they plan to dig up and sell, those reserves total roughly 5,000 gigatons of carbon. The problem is, the world's scientists are clear that if we're to hold the planet's temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, the target reiterated at December's Paris talks, then we can only burn at most 900 gigatons more carbon. 5,900. That is to say, if we allow the business plans of these companies to play out, there's no drama or mystery to the climate story. The math is impossible. If we burn any significant percentage of that carbon, the hope of avoiding climactic disaster is gone. This, again, is not ideology, it's physics. Once you know that math, you understand these companies differently. They take on a rogue aspect. They are driving precisely the changes that you must deal with every day. If it's expensive to fill the state budget hole when a record warm winter drives down the rooms and meals tax receipt, if it's expensive to rebuild the state's bridges and roads in the wake of Irene, if it's expensive to deal with the spread of Lyme disease, well, then there's something deeply ironic about investing in the very companies that are driving the need for these expenditures. The very first public official to endorse divestment on the very first day of that campaign was Seattle Mayor Mike McKibben. If his city was being forced to build seawalls to deal with climate change, he said, he thought it made no sense to pay for them by investing in the very companies that made them necessary. You can call this a moral argument if you wish. It is immoral to wreck the planet. And in my volunteer work as the founder of 350.org, I've gotten to meet an awful lot of the people paying the price around the world, and I'm happy to talk about them. You could call it a pragmatic argument to save the state future financial and ecological distress. Or, interestingly, you could call it a financial argument per se. Because if you think about it, the logic of our predicament as a planet dictates that we will try to do something about climate change. We see the beginnings of those somethings in places like the Paris Climate Conference. And as we begin to restrict the amount of carbon we can burn, well, those 5,000 gigatons of reserves are likely to become, in the words of financial analysts, stranded. If the world scientists say they can't be burned, then there will be pressure not to burn them. States and nations from California to China have begun to adopt prices on carbon. Other restrictions are appearing, like President Obama's Clean Power Plan, and initiatives will sprout up like China's all-out drive for renewable power that's now cut their coal consumption 2 years running. The result is that the value of those reserves begin to shrink, and it is precisely those reserves that give those fossil fuel companies their value. That value, as it turns out, has been destroyed in the coal industry in the last few years. It's been the worst performing of all economic sectors, with many companies losing 95% or more of their value. When we pointed out this possibility 3 years ago to state officials, we were ignored. And as a result, Vermont has suffered significant financial losses. Those who oppose divesting even out of coal have devoted considerable effort to saying those losses can't be precisely quantified, but obviously they are real and large, and they could have been avoided with the expertise Vermont had on hand. The same value destruction is well underway in other sectors of the fossil fuel industry, which have underperformed broader markets for the last 5 years and are currently tanking. No one can predict the movement of equities from day to day, and indeed, all we've asked is that the state announce plans to sell its stock over the next 5 years in order to avoid unloading at the bottom. But it's easy to predict the general movement of these industries. Trend lines are very clear. That's why one financial institution after another has endorsed the basic math that I laid out for you earlier and its implications. The notion of stranded assets and carbon bubbles was, 4 years ago, me writing in Rolling Stone. Now it's the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and Deutsche Bank and a host of others using the same math. Last fall, it was the governor of the Bank of England addressing the world's insurance industries at the venerable Lloyd's of London and explaining to them that they were riskily overexposed to a fossil fuel industry riding a carbon bubble much bigger even than the housing bubble, which did so much damage to the world's economy. I am not suggesting to you that you divest from fossil fuels for financial reasons. That would be crass. I am suggesting to you that you can satisfy the moral instincts of Vermonters without suffering a financial penalty. That is crass too, but a certain crassness is unavoidable in political affairs. And you've been granted one of the rare, easy cases where you can do both good and well at the same time. A free throw, a penalty kick, a hand with house money, pick your metaphor. Okay? If you do so, you will be in good company. The sweep of institutions that have decided to divest from coal and extreme oil like tar sands extraction, or from all fossil fuels is truly remarkable. May I single out a few Vermont-based early adopters: Sterling, Green Mountain, Goddard Colleges, Vermont Law School. They join peers like Stanford, Oxford, Edinburgh, the universities of California, Washington, and Hawaii, Georgetown. Just this week, the University of Stockholm. Dozens of cities around the world have joined in, as has the state of California, whose 2 pension funds, one covering teachers, the other the rest of public employees, are 2 of the 20 largest funds on earth. Religious denominations, from the Episcopalians, the Unitarians, United Church of Christ, the biggest insurance companies in France and Germany, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway, which is the largest pool of investable capital on earth. Together, these portfolios and endowments control at least $3.4 trillion worth of capital. Even the Rockefeller family, the first family of fossil fuel, decided to divest its charities, arguing that it was neither morally sound or financially prudent to remain invested in the family business. I've heard two primary arguments against Vermont divesting. The first is that it will put the state on a slippery slope where legislators are constantly called on to make investment decisions. History makes it clear that this is an unwarranted fear and that such calls arise only very occasionally. That's because, though many companies do bad things, those bad things are generally not central to the company's operations. Apple may pay its Chinese workers abysmally low wages. In that case, we can and do organize to demand better conduct, pressuring them through the usual tools of shareholder engagement or consumer boycott. They then raise those wages, the price of an iPhone rises by $1 or $2, and the world goes on. Tobacco and fossil fuel are among the few industries where the problem is not a flaw in the business plan, but the business plan itself. This leads to the second argument against divestment, which is that we'd be better off engaging with the industry to get it to change. That's likely to be folly for the reasons that I've described above. The problem is precisely the center of their business plan, so changes around the edge will be cosmetic at best. As Beavis Longstreth, twice appointed to the SEC by Ronald Reagan and a champion of divestment, put it, trying to convince Johnny Walker to give up its distilleries is likely to be a fool's errand. And in the event, we have plenty of empirical proof it will not work. Earlier this week, for instance, Neva Rockefeller Goodwin, an economist who was an heir to the Exxon fortune, announced that she had sold all her shares, donating the proceeds to the fight against climate change. She'd taken the step, she said, because 15 years of supporting shareholder resolutions and privately lobbying company executives had been completely ineffective. And this was her family business. Vermont's treasurer deserves credit for traveling to Exxon's annual meeting last year to try this engagement tactic herself. But her sound argument there had no effect. The resolution she supported failed overwhelmingly, as it has for a quarter century, and the company continued about its business, spending millions of dollars every day exploring for new hydrocarbons, even though the science is already clear that we have 5 times as much coal and oil and gas as we could ever safely burn. There's a final argument one could make, that it's not really the fault of these companies, but rather our own desire for fossil fuel that keeps warming the planet. And it's here that you realize why the most important step Vermont should take is to back the governor's call to divest from ExxonMobil. That's because we've learned in the last 6 months what many had long suspected, that the biggest oil company had in fact known all about climate change 30 years ago. A pair of investigations by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists at the Los Angeles Times and from the Columbia Journalism School showed beyond any doubt that it's as early as the late 1970s, its own scientists had laid out precisely what would happen as the planet warmed. Indeed, the company used that data to bid on leases in the melting Arctic and to climate-proof its own installations, drilling rigs and the like, against rising seas. But in public, they insisted the science was unsound and invested huge sums in building think tanks to spread disinformation and deceit. In other words, they never gave our societies a chance for a reasonable reaction to climate change. Had they merely said what they knew to be the truth, that global warming was very real and very dangerous, we would have avoided a quarter century of phony debate and gotten to work on solutions. We would not have licked climate change yet, but we'd be well on the way. This has been described as the greatest corporate scandal of all time, and in some ways it continues to this day. Exxon, for instance, and its partners bankroll the political campaigns of the most vociferous climate deniers, making sure that Congress never takes coherent action. Were Vermont to divest, we would play a serious role in helping spread the message that we must leave most carbon in the ground and that companies should no longer play deceitful political games. On Exxon in particular, Vermont can still provide meaningful leadership. the kind of leadership that the attorney generals of New York and California have recently done in launching investigations of the company. What Vermont cannot do or should not do, at least in good conscience, is delay or posture. Sending a recommendation to VPIC is nothing but delay. They've made it clear already that such a recommendation will fall on deaf ears. So it's time for our political leaders to do the job of leading. In this case, that clearly means taking this modest but useful step of divesting from coal and from Exxon, and doing it now while there's still time for it to have real effect in the real world. Thank you.
Any questions for? Oh,
I got a couple.
sure.
You work for Middlebury College. Have they got rid of their
They have not.
divestment of their endowments?
They have not.
And the other piece is the comprehensive energy plan said that 80% of a lot of the problems come from energy use and stuff. Transportation is half of that. So I'm just wondering if maybe we should do something around transportation in our state and in our country.
You should.
Instead of mandating restrictions on the investments of our pension funds.
The good news is that these are by no means mutually exclusive. You can and should do both. One of the most useful things in standing against ExxonMobil's long legacy of deceit would be precisely in that area around motor fuels. They've worked hard to make sure that other options, electric transportation, for instance, aren't being developed as quickly as they should. So that's a good point.
Jim?
Mr. McKibben, thanks for coming. We've heard a lot of this discussion over the past couple of weeks, and I'm not making a judgment in particular which way this should go, but my concern is around this morality issue. And again, we talked about the federal government in such a split, such a paralyzation between conservative and liberal. My concern here is when you talk about ExxonMobil in particular, they have over 75,000 employees. They have hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropic ventures that they do throughout the world. Again, my concern here is, are you saying that those 75,000 employees and company heads and so on are immoral in the sense of what they're doing in the business that they work for? This is where I have a problem with this discussion.
No, I think most of the employees could be safely classified as not immoral. I do think that the leadership of Exxon has been, in fact, wrong in every possible way. So, for instance, the former CEO of Exxon, Lee Raymond, who in fact was the reporting executive to whom the company's scientists in the 1970s and early 1980s were explaining the reality of climate change, who was signing off on their work. As CEO in 1997, not only did they help recruit people from the tobacco industry for their think tanks and so on, but in 1997 he journeyed to China, where he gave a speech to the World Petroleum Congress, in which he said that the world was cooling and that it would make no difference whether we took steps now or 25 years from now. These were things his company knew to be untrue. They were, at that very moment, raising all the oil rigs that they were building to account for the fact that they knew sea level was going to rise. So you can make the call on whether that's moral or not. The highest I've ever risen in the ecclesial hierarchy is Methodist Sunday school teacher. That doesn't, I think, equip me to judge morality, but I do think that it was wrong and would be wrong for anyone to say one thing and do another in that regard.
Ron, did you have a question? Or were you pointing at Mark? So, I just want to, you'd think I'd know this after all this time, but there are actually two issues around what we're talking about here with fossil fuel companies. One is the use of the fossil fuels that is spewing stuff, whatever that stuff is. And the other is the extraction of the reserves that we need to be really, I have this picture of us extracting all these reserves and then creating a big hole in the middle of the earth and it collapsing on itself. I know that that's probably not, but that's kind of the way I look at reserves. But so
as a
there are
connoisseur
those
of
two.
disasters, let me just say that's one we don't need to worry about.
But there are those two kind of, and we're talking here about basically the extraction issue because it's clearly around.
They're very linked
It's-
to the degree that
yeah.
this stuff gets dug up,
Right.
it gets burned.
Right.
That's why the sort of catchphrase is we need to keep
Right.
it in the ground.
Right, okay.
Well, first of all, what was that Norwegian organization you talked about, the largest pension?
Norwegian's sovereign wealth fund. They've taken the money they made mostly from the oil industry over the last 40 or 50 years, in a period when we didn't, for the most part, understand about climate change. And they've said, so far, at least on coal and tar sands oil, we're not going to be investing in those things anymore. In essence, Norway has begun to take its winnings from the fossil fuel casino and say, we're going to go, we're going to take these off the table now.
So you get around quite a bit, it seems, and you listed a whole bunch of entities that have divested in one way or another. And I'm wondering if in your travels and your conversations with these folks, any of them have expressed regret and said, gee, I wish we hadn't divested because now we're losing money. I mean,
no, it was never one of my career aspirations to be a financial advisor, and I wouldn't hold myself out as one at all. But I have been impressed by the number of people who've said, "Thank you. We got out some years ago and saved an awful lot of money." The Rockefeller family actually issued a report on this in the last year, detailing how both morally, from their point of view, and financially advantageous this has been. And for the reason, it's not, I guess the thing to realize is, it's not simply chance or cycle that's driving down the price of coal companies and now oil and gas companies. We're in the middle of a large change away from fossil fuel to something else. And as a result, there's going to be continued downward pressure on those companies unless they prove agile enough to change their business model and become the pioneers in renewable energy that they could be, but so far have refused to be.
thanks.
Any more questions for Mr. McKibben? Thank you so much for
Thank you
coming.
very
Thank
much.
you. I should say, if you have written testimony,